It's Mike from Mike's Unboxing, and today we're going to be taking a quick look around the BIOS on the MSI Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. This is the B550 version. Some of you have asked for this to be done, so I figured I'd make a quick video so you can take a look around and see what the BIOS is like. This is the main BIOS screen, as you can probably see, and it gives you the information about CPU core temperatures, motherboard temperatures, vCore values, DDR voltages, etc. Your BIOS mode, whether you're in compatibility mode or UEFI. Also, it tells you the motherboard's version and also the CPU you're using. We're using a Ryzen 5 3600 6-core, and our memory size is 16 gigabytes. Current BIOS version is the version 0.140, so basically version 14, and the current BIOS build date is the 29th of the 10th, 2020. In the top corner, we've got things like our time and date. So this is Friday the 29th of Jan 2020, and our current CPU speed is 3.6 gigahertz, and our DDR speed is 3600 megahertz, which is pretty much the sweet spot for the Zen processor. So in this top corner, this is in your kind of main mode. There's two options. So you've got easy mode and you've got advanced. So this is now the easy mode, which is what normally you would see first of all. I generally tend to like using the advanced mode. So in the easy mode, again, you've got a very similar setup. So you've got your boot priority, and this gives you the option for dragging and dropping various options there. So if you want to change your boot priority, you can do there. Also, you've got things like boot from LAN you can do from the UEFI, USBs, etc, etc. In this top left side, we've got options for gain boost for CPU, so you can enable or disable that, which will give you basically a little bit of an overclock. Also, you've got your options for setting your XMP profiles, so profile 1 or profile 2, depending on your memory. And down this left-hand side, we've got CPU, which is what we're currently in, so it tells you your CPU frequency, etc, ratios, and what instruction sets you've got on, whether you've got virtual machine, hyper-threading enabled, all those kinds of things. Moving down, we've got memory, so again it will tell you what slots are being used, and also your XMP profile settings. So XMP profile 1 and 2 are both the same on this particular board, so yeah, got no real choice between the two, so you could, if you want to, use profile 1 or profile 2, makes no real difference. If we go into storage, currently we're in AHCI mode, and it tells you which devices are present. So if you're having any kind of boot issues or trouble installing Windows, do check this section just to make sure that the drive that you're actually trying to install onto is detected in the BIOS and listed. On this one, we've got our silicon powered M.2 drive in our M.2 slot number 1, which is the top slot. Moving down, we've got fan information. So this is basic fan information for the CPU or CPU pump, whichever you've got set up. And being that we've got 6 system fan headers, you've got options on here for fan 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And also you've got your settings cog, so you can go in and make changes. So clicking on the settings cog, you can go into the hardware monitor, but we'll check that out more when we go into the advanced mode. Also, you've got options for help, so it tells you what the individual settings are. So if there's anything in this video that I haven't covered, which no doubt there will be something, you can go through and choose the options here. So gain boost off, gain boost on, so basically enables the PBO, so we could choose that. Now precision boost overclocking is enabled. Also tells you how to navigate through, so you can use your mouse obviously, as you can see with my cursor, or you can use the arrow keys up, down, left, right to move, enter to select, etc, etc. Some of those are quite actually handy to use or to actually remember. F10 is one I quite often use, which is the save and reset, and also the screenshot button if you're trying to capture some information. That's always quite useful. Moving down to the bottom, we've got our M flash. So if we go into M flash, you can then go into enter the BIOS flashing mode, and it'll give you an option. At this point, you'd want to have your USB stick with the current version of the BIOS you wish to flash on, and you can go into flashing mode and go through all that. We won't be doing a BIOS flash on this. We have done it in a previous video, which I'll link in the video description, but that is the M flash section. Also, you've got favorites, so you can set up various favorites for your menu. It's yeah, a little bit pointless, that one, to be honest with you, but it is an option. You've got hardware monitor, which basically goes into the kind of the fan setting thing again, just another way of getting into the same setting, gives you information about your fan speeds, temperatures, etc, etc. Moving across, we've got the CPU fan warning control, so if you're using some kind of maybe some sort of cooling system which doesn't give out a RPM value, you can choose that to have that either enabled or disabled to prevent boot errors or the press F1 or press F2 to continue error message on the BIOS when you boot up. ErP is our energy saving feature, so you can turn that on or off, and your HD audio controller, you can go into that and either enable or disable. Also, you've got options for changing the CSM or UEFI, so that is for booting methods. If you're trying to boot from an older hard drive perhaps, which has been installed with maybe Windows 7 previously, then sometimes that can be useful, and for some certain SATA devices that can be quite handy. Also, you've got the option for turning on AHCI or RAID, which you can enable or disable there. Whichever one is highlighted in red is the one which is active. So currently UEFI is enabled and AHCI is enabled for our disks. RAID is disabled as it is grayed out. Also as well, we've got the easy LED control, so we can go into that and you can enable or disable that feature. So that is pretty much it for the basic setting. So if we click on the top, so where it says advanced, or you can press the F7 key to switch between the two. So this is now in the advanced mode. So we've got a little bit more granularity of the controls. So if we go into, first of all, we go into settings. So in settings, we've got system status, advanced, boot, security, and save and exit. So if we go into system status, we can go in and see the time, date, what is present, etc., and some of the information that we had on the front screen. Also, you've got your DMI information, which is your digital information, so the manufacturer's info, all that kind of good stuff. Go back to settings and go into advanced. So we'll go into each one of these individuals. I'll try and put some timestamps in as well, so you can see all these individual things. This is going to be a long video, so yeah, do make use of the timestamps if you need to. So in here we've got PCI subsystem settings, and if you can go into there, you've got options for the cryptocurrency mining or above 4G memory. Generally, most of this stuff you can leave set to automatic. If you want full information on these individual settings, let me know in the comment section and we'll try and go into some deeper depth. Don't want to go too deep into this at the moment because really that is more an advanced thing and possibly not something that we'll be covering in this overview of the BIOS. So next up is ACPI settings. So this is basically power management and that kind of stuff. So you've got the option for power LED. So when the system is into sleep mode, you can have the power LED set to blinking mode or dual color, just so you've got a visual representation of what is going on with the system. And you've also got your CPU over temperature alert. So you can have this enabled if you wanted to. So if the CPU gets above its rated temperatures, it will basically either not allow the system to boot, or it will shut the system down to prevent any damage. Generally, I would leave this to auto and hope and pray that it never needs to shut down. Next up is your integrated peripherals. So this is quite handy if you've got a system which is running a graphics card and also an APU, and if you're having issues with booting, etc., or any confusion there. So VGA card detection, you can set to auto or ignore. So if you want to, you can get it to ignore your onboard graphics card. If you're maybe, I don't know, whatever your configuration is, there's an option there so you can change it. Your onboard LAN controller is enabled, so generally I'd leave that enabled unless you deliberately want to disable network access. And you've got the LAN option ROM, so that is to allow bootable information into the LAN. Most people don't really want that sort of thing, so I'd leave that disabled. Network stack, again, this is all part of the UEFI network stack optimization for IP4 and IPv6 function. The onboard Wi-Fi module control, so this actually will disable the Bluetooth and the Wi-Fi. So you can go into here and you can choose enabled or disabled. I guess most people are going to want it to have it enabled because that's probably why you paid a little bit extra for the board. Next up, we've got our SATA configurations. So you've got the option for SATA mode or RAID mode, as we discussed a little bit earlier. And also you've got the options for hot plug as well. So if you want to have a SATA device to have hot plug, you can enable or disable that. Again, entirely up to you. Generally I'd set it to disabled. Most people don't hot plug SATA devices these days. And also audio configuration, you've got your HD audio controller. So if you're using a separate sound card, you can set that to disabled and it will disable the onboard audio. Again, most people will probably have that enabled. Next up is our USB configuration. This could be quite useful, especially for those of you trying to install Windows, or maybe you're using a slightly different operating system. So you've got the XHCI handoff, which generally should be enabled, and legacy USB support enabled. Both of those generally I would leave as they are. So this legacy USB support means if you've got a slightly older USB device, or maybe an operating system which doesn't support USB keyboard and mouse, that type of thing, it essentially allows that to work. So you can use an older operating system but with a USB keyboard and mouse. and kind of vice versa. So it's like a two-way legacy support for maybe older devices or potentially older operating systems. And the handoff for XHCI is essentially for supporting USB 3.0 devices on operating systems or components that don't support it, etc, etc. Essentially both of those kind of work in a very similar way. Also, you've got enhanced mouse pointer speed, so you can change that from 1 to 20. I've just left it as standard. You can change that if you want to, so let's change it to 5, and yeah, it just basically increases the zoom. So I'm going to go back to level 1 because otherwise it's essentially unusable. So then we've got power management setup. So this is your ERP. So if you've got a system or you're in a particular environment where you have to adhere to the 2013 regulations on energy requirements, then you can have that enabled or not. Restore after AC power loss. So depending on what you're using the system from, if the system for some reason loses power, do you want the system to basically come back on by itself, or do you want to it remain powered off? You can choose the last state. So if the PC was on whilst you're having a power cut, then it will try and reboot. If you have it set to power off, so regardless, if you have a power outage, it won't turn itself back on, and you can have it on to power on. So if it does lose power and then the power returns, it will try and boot up the system again. Next up, we've got the system power fault protection. So if you've got any abnormalities with your power supply or any irregular voltage, it will prevent the system from booting. Again, you can have that enabled or disabled. The choice is yours. I generally leave it as it was disabled. It doesn't really make a great deal of difference. In the UK, we have a relatively clean power supply, and also I use relatively good power supplies, which is open to conjecture. Entirely up to you how you set this. If you're in a country where you've got a pretty dirty power supply and maybe you leave your PC doing something while you're away from the system, maybe you running a server type application, anything like that, then I would say leave it to power on or last state. Moving back to the menu, so we've got Windows OS configuration. So you've got the option for the BIOS. So again, you've got the UEFI or CSM mode. You can choose CSM if you want to for added compatibility or support for different operating systems. Windows 10 generally works absolutely fine with UEFI and is designed for that type of application. Next up is the GOP information. So this is basically your graphical output information. That essentially is a protocol used by the system. I honestly don't know what this is for, if I'm completely honest with you. I think it's just something to do with how the system displays a BIOS via the graphical interface and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you'll probably never need to know what it is, but it certainly is there. Next one is Secure Boot. So you've got the Secure Boot options. Again, most people probably never need to use this, but this is all to do with using secure boot keys, TPM management, key management, all that kind of stuff. So if you are into that kind of stuff and you do have a requirement for secure booting, etc., then this is where you can make the changes to that particular subsystem. Next up is the wake up event. So you can have wake up events set by whatever, so RTC alarm, PCI Express device, USB device, etc, etc. I generally just leave that as it is. Of course, if you want to enable S3, S4, S5 by keyboard and mouse, so wake up devices, then you can enable those if you wish to. Most of this stuff is actually handled by Windows particularly well, so I would leave it as that. Next up is secure erase. So you can actually do a secure erase of your SSDs, that kind of thing, and also underneath there you've also got the option for the NVMe Self test, so you can go in and choose it. This particular model for some reason isn't supported, so I'm not too sure why that is. Next up is the AMD overclocking, which we we'll take a look at when we go into the OC tab shortly, but essentially it's just another way of getting in there, and you've got the message on there saying this could essentially reduce the lifespan of your components. So obviously, do you want to accept or decline? If you click accept, you can go in and you can see all the individual bits and pieces here, but pretty much all of that is actually in the OC mode. So yeah, manual OC, voltage control, that kind of stuff. But we'll take a look at that when we go back into the OC section. So go back and yeah, let's go through and continue into boot. And you've got options for your boot settings. Again, pretty much the same as the boot priority mode at the top here, which you can drag and drop. So you've got options for the full screen logo display. So if you don't want the MSI splash screen on your display, you can disable that. So click on it, choose disabled. I actually quite like it on, so I'm going to leave it on. Boot lock, number lock state. So if you're using a 10 keyless keyboard, then you might want to leave that off. again, entirely up to you. I generally leave mine on because I'm using a full-size UK keyboard and I quite like to use the keypad for the pin entry on startup, so I leave that on. Info block effect, you can have that locked or unlocked. So that is basically to do with the graphic engine. Post beep, again, that is for the onboard speaker if you've got one, or if you've got one connected, so you can have that enabled or disabled. Sometimes it's handy to have it for boot diagnosis, but generally, because the board has got those 4 diagnostic LEDs, you can generally leave this as disabled, but some people like the old school bleeps, so again, you can choose that enabled or disabled. I'm going to leave that enabled. Then underneath, we've got our boot order priorities, so this is specific boot orders. So generally, in boot option 1, if you're just normally booting Windows, you want your UEFI hard disk, or your AHCI hard disk, or your RAID setup, all that kind of stuff. And then you can choose your other boot options. So I've got a boot option of the CD DVD drive, and then USB hard drive, etc, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change that. So we'll move that and we'll change it to number 2. So if you are trying to boot for the first time using a USB hard drive, you can just drag that to the top, then make sure you change it back after. So that's your different boot options there. You can move those around and configure which you want. Most of them probably you could set to disabled if you wanted to, which sometimes may make a slightly quicker boot. So again, go and choose all those and get rid of all that. Again, if you're having issues with the system booting, you can go through and disable or enable drives just to make things work a little bit quicker. If you've got more than one drive connected, then you can go into the hard drive BBS priorities. So in your boot option, you can choose there. So if you have more than one drive listed, then you could choose which one is the priority. So if you have 2 NVMe drives, for instance, or an SSD and a NVMe drive, then those will show up there and you can choose which one of them is your primary boot device. So we're going to choose the Windows Boot Manager on our main drive because that is the one we're using. So back into settings, then you've got security. So you can set up an administrator password or a user password if you wanted to. Also, you can configure your trusted computing modules. Generally, most people I think will leave this disabled, so I would certainly leave that disabled. If you are using a trusted platform module, then your module supplier or your system administrator will give you information of what security settings you need to enter there. And the last one in this particular section is save and exit. Obviously, once you've made all your settings to the system and you're happy, you can save and exit, and that will then reboot the system. So that's it for settings. We go into OC. So we've got the OC Explore mode. So this is, you can choose normal or expert. So if you've got expert, it just shows a few more things in these individual settings. So we'll leave that as standard into normal. Then you've got your CPU settings. So you've got your CPU ratio apply. So you can set individual ratios, or you can do it per CCX if you've got a multiple CCX CPU. Most people I think will probably go all core. Generally, I would say for overclocking purposes, probably your best bet to do is to use the Ryzen Master software, and then once you're happy with that in that interface, you can then transfer those settings into this box here if you want to then remove Ryzen Master or you want the settings to be permanent. In the CPU ratio, again, you can set to auto. You can put in a manual setting there. So in this particular system, we've got a 3.6 GHz CPU, which is capable of around about 3.9 GHz all-core boost. So if you wanted to, you could just put 3.9 in there and leave that as it is, or if you've set some overclocks, you could put it to 4, whatever the case may be. You can choose your individual CPU ratio. So we'll leave that as auto. That's for now, because for stability's sake. In advanced CPU configuration, you can go in and there's a lot more stuff here. So you've got AMD Overclocking, so you've got your Precision Boost Overdrive, which is enabled, which we can do a lot easier from this Game Boost section. Just click on there, and if we change that now, turn it off, go into OC settings, and we'll go into advanced CPU configuration, and AMD Overclocking, and you can see now it's just set to auto. So we can set that to on, go back into OC settings again, go into advanced CPU configuration, AMD overclocking, and as you can see now it is specifically enabled rather than being just automatic. So you've got CPU core control, you can choose either 2 or 4 CCDs, all that kind of stuff. SMT control, auto or disabled, so that is for the simultaneous multi-threading, so you can make changes to that, basically enable it or disable it. LN2 mode 2, so that is the basically for extreme overclocking when you're at very low temperatures, all that kind of stuff. You can make changes there, so enabled, disabled, whatever. Again, most of this you probably want to leave to automatic, just to let it do what it needs to do. And in the NUMA settings, again, you've got various settings there. Again, if you're not too sure what it is, then leave it as auto. This will, there's some of this stuff that can be quite confusing. So essentially, if you're not sure what it is, leave it alone or do a quick Google and you'll find out exactly what those things do. So also in advanced CPU configuration, we should take a look at the other items there. So we've got the AMD Overclocking, so that is kind of like your main section. We've also got the AMD CBS, which stands for Core Boost, I believe. Yeah, Performance Core Boost, that kind of thing. So in this option, we've got Core Performance Boost, we've got set to auto. Options for that are disabled or auto. Global C-state control, we've got enabled, disabled, or auto. Again, for most overclocking purposes, I would say leave these to auto unless you know exactly what you're doing, or unless you've saved your BIOS so you can actually reply back to it after. Power supply idle control, again, you can choose that. Auto is probably the best way to go. Most of this is auto anyway, so really just leave it as is. You've got the NUMA nodes per socket. You've got the also the kind of input and output stuff. So you've got the IMO, that's auto, disabled, or enabled. So that basically enables or disables the IO MMU function. Leave that to auto. You've got the LN2 mode 1. So again, for cold booting situations, for liquid nitrogen cooling, that sort of stuff, you can enable or disable that kind of stuff. You've also got the package power limit. So you can actually make modifications there. Again, auto is probably your friend here. But you can put a manual wattage range in there in watts, anywhere between 45 watts up to 1,000 watts. So yeah, you can artificially select a limit. I think there is actually kind of like a hard limit wired into the system anyway. So regardless, you could put 1,000 watts in there. I'm pretty sure it'd still limit at a certain place way before that anyway. CPPC, so that is the Collaborative Power Performance Control. And again, if you're not too sure what that is, you're probably best off leaving it alone. But if you go into enabled, and then you can let it do its own thing. Same with the preferred cores as well. Essentially, this is all the same stuff as what is actually in the Ryzen Master, just laid out slightly differently and with a few different naming conventions. So yeah, feel free to have a play in there. Personally, I'm not a hardcore overclocker. Literally, generally I just put on Game Boost or use Ryzen Master and just manually overclock it. But then after, I generally set it all back to auto just for the sake of stability and basically longevity. So going back, we've got SMV mode, so that enables your virtualization. So if you're using virtual machine or Windows Sandbox, VMware, all that kind of stuff, then you're going to want to set that to enabled. Doesn't really have a performance hit as far as I know, so I'm going to actually enable it just in case. You've got the NX mode, which is the non-execute page function for processors. You can enable that or disable it. Also, you've got the PSS support. You can set it to auto, enabled or disabled. Leave that to auto again. If you're not too sure what it is, leave it well alone. And also you've got your performance regulator. So in this, actually, you can, if you want to, you can make some performance changes. So if you're running a specific program, it will actually give you a slight performance improvement based on what it is. So if you're doing a memory test in IDA64, if you set that first of all, it will kind of optimize the system for that particular benchmark. Again, I generally would leave that disabled unless you're specifically benchmarking and you want to kind of get the best possible scores. But if you're just using the system as a normal everyday person, just gaming and all that kind of stuff, then I would leave it disabled. Spectrum or spread spectrum, that is basically for EMI. So if you're suffering with electromagnetic interference, then you can enable it, disable it, or leave it as auto. Again, auto probably is your best bet there. And also you've got your current optimization for your SoC for the CPU. So again, you can have auto or custom setting, and you can go through and set all these different things, which again, if you're not too sure what you're doing, I'm not going to make any recommendations. You better off leaving it on auto. So that, I think, is pretty much it for this section. Next up, we've got the base clock settings. So again, you can set your base clock. Again, depending on what you're overclocking, most of you would probably leave this to auto, but if you've changed it and you've increased your base clock slightly, the megahertz frequency, then obviously you can put that in there manually and leave that in there so that when you reboot in future, then that will remain constant rather than basically having to use Ryzen Master. Again, Ryzen Master is probably your friend on this if you're not too sure what you're doing. If you're an experienced overclocker, then obviously feel free to tamper with this stuff and do whatever you need to do. Next up is our DRAM settings. So we've got our XMP profiles, which are listed there. So you can choose your individual profile, and also you can change your DRAM frequency as well. So you just click on that, and there's a whole host of DRAM frequencies up to DDR4 6000, which you can choose from. But again, choose whichever one suits you. Again, this is a 3600 processor, so even though the RAM that we've got will do up to 4000, we're best off at 3666 because that is basically kind of like the sweet spot. Sorry, 3600 is the sweet spot. My mistake. So that is the XMP profiles there. So we've got our F-clock frequency now. That is showing as 1800, so it's basically half of the DDR speed, which basically means it's running pretty much as best it possibly can. You can have these mixed and have different ratios. Again, if you want to find more about that, then maybe we can do a video in the future about that. Uclock division mode, so then you can change those as well. So you've got dividers you can change. Generally, I would leave that to auto. Again, from the memory, you can, if you want to, just leave it as auto and let the system do what it needs to do. It is going to set to, if I have it to auto, it'll set to 4000. 3600 is the best. Yeah, again, entirely up to you what you want to do there, depending on your memory. This is the memory try it section, so you can have that enabled, and you can go for different memory types, so you can choose a specific speed, all that kind of stuff, and it will actually test the memory at different F-clock values and different CAS latencies. Again, slightly more advanced overclocking, but that will go through and test different memory features and to see if they're actually suitable. Again, very good for overclocking. Memory failure retry, so you've got that enabled. So basically when the system is doing its RAM kind of synchronization for the first time, or if you've made any settings change, it'll go through and it will cycle a couple of times. If for some reason the RAM setting doesn't work, then it will try another one, and you can choose how many tries it attempts on each setting. So I've got mine set to 2, which I think is actually the default setting. Again, entirely up to you how you do it. I'm going to actually leave that disabled because we're not doing any memory overclocking currently. Memory fast boot, so that is the fast boot function. You can have that enabled or disabled. Again, your choice entirely. And then you've got advanced DRAM configuration where you can actually manually put in your CAS latencies. So if for some reason you've got a sticker RAM and it's got specific latencies written actually on the sticker, but the XMP profile doesn't correlate to that, you can manually put in your timings here, which is really useful for some Corsair RAM specifically. That does seem to be a little bit problematic, picking up some of the XMP timings on MSI boards for some reason, not sure why. But then you can just put in your own settings there to make sure that everything is working as it should do. Also, you've got sub-timing configuration. Again, this is very advanced stuff. Most of you probably won't want to be looking around in here too much, but certainly for those of you that are into playing around and squeezing the most out of your systems, there are options available to you. You've got the turnaround time-ins. Again, most of this will be set to auto. Miscellaneous items, so again, this is more for in-depth stuff for memory. Memory stuff, there is so many things. A lot of people think it's just a couple of CAS latency settings, like the ones we generally tend to see in most programs, but there is so much more going on underneath the hood, and this board does give you a lot of flexibility to change all that kind of stuff. Again, on-die termination configuration, you can change all those settings, your CAD bus timing configuration, CAD bus strength configurations, and your PHY configurations. Again, all of that stuff you can go into, but it is set to auto as default, so my suggestions would be to kind of leave that where it is. In the voltage settings, we've got the digital power, which basically you can go and set your things like load line calibration, your over voltage, your over current protection, your CPU switching frequency, the VRM over thermal protection. So you can enable that, and if you maybe want to increase the limits of what the default is for the system, you can then manually change a setting. Obviously, don't change these settings unnecessarily because they can increase or rather decrease your stability of the system. But again, if you're an advanced overclocker and you know what you're doing, then feel free to set your VRM thermal protection to whatever you feel is necessary. This will actually allow you to overclock, or at least to precision boost overclock a little bit more, because it will let the VRMs go up to a higher temperature. Realistically, with this particular board, it's actually a really good VRM setup, so you shouldn't need to do anything there, but certainly you can do if you want to. Also, you've got your load line calibration for the North Bridge and the SoC. Basically the same stuff all over again. So you've got the SoC recurrent protection, switching frequencies, and your 12 volt expander. Now in that one, you can go in and expand the value rating of the overcurrent protection, the 12 volt input voltage. Again, if you're not too sure, don't play with it. But again, for advanced overclockers, you can tweak it to your heart's content. Realistically, all of that, I would say you're best off leaving as automatic. Next up, we've got some more voltage settings. So you can change your core voltage, so you can set that to a lower setting. If you want to do some undervolting, you can certainly do that in here. Again, if you're not too sure, leave it as auto, but certainly the flexibility is there to change it. Also, the same deal with the SoC, you can change that voltage as well. So if you're finding temps a little bit on the low side, or you're having issues with stability, then you can tweak those to your particular settings. Next up, we've got the VDDP, so again, voltage controls. Again, if you're not too sure what these are, please do leave them alone and don't mess around with them unnecessarily. There are guides on the internet which will go into this in a greater depth, but essentially you probably need to have a greater understanding of how your system works first of all before you go playing around with these. Again, I leave these to auto just because, well, basically for stability's sake. DRAM voltage, again, you've got the option there, so if you are trying to squeeze a little bit more out of your DRAM, you can certainly up the voltage. Currently, normally most DDR4 DRAM likes to be set at 1.35. Currently our automatic voltage is set to 1.344, so slightly under. Again, you can underclock RAM if you want to, but if you're being slightly more aggressive and trying to get a bit more out of it, higher, you're trying to get a lower CAS rating or a higher frequency, then you can certainly jump the voltage up a little bit. Again, if you're not too sure, leave it alone, because yeah, you can cause damage quite easily. So you've got other DRAM voltages there, so also you can change the individual voltage for the individual channels. So because this is a dual channel setup, if you've got one particular channel which needs a little bit more voltage than the other to get stability, certainly you can go ahead and do that in there. Moving down, we've got CPU specifications, which we know about, we've seen previously. Certainly it'll give you an idea of your microcodes, level 2 caches, level 3 cache, etc, etc. And CPU technology support, so you can see what extensions are supported. So we've got MMX, etc, SSE, SSE2, 3, 4, blah blah blah, etc, etc. Yeah, very boring. Very strange not to see 3D Now. You'd think 3D Now being one of AMD's kind of flagship products many years ago. Yeah, not applicable. So let's go back. So that is our technology support, and then we go into memory Z. So this will read the SPD timings, or the serial presence detect, of your individual RAM sticks. So this is actually reading from the chip itself. It gives you all the information. So this is a V-color stick. Standard frequency is DDR4 2666, and the size, basically you've got the CAS latencies. So you could effectively, if you wanted to, copy and paste this, or write it down and then transfer that into your XMP settings, but essentially they should be exactly the same. XMP support is basically should report exactly what was on the previous screen. So that is it for the OC section. So let's go into mFlash, which again is basically to automatically reboot the system and go into flashing mode. If you're trying to do this, make sure you've got a USB stick or USB hard drive with the appropriate BIOS on there if you want to do any flashing. We won't bother doing that again, we have done that in a previous video. So going back to the very start again, so now we've got on the side there, we've got OC profile, so you can actually save and store overclocking profiles. So once you've created one, you can go into it and do all your settings, etc, and name it. So if it's with a certain cooler or a certain setup, you can name it. Not very much excitement there, unfortunately. Go back, and hardware monitor is the one that I think most of you are probably going to be looking for. Now if you're using a relatively cheapish RGB fan controller set, this is probably where you want to be looking. If you go into the Red Dragon software within Windows, it won't always change this setting on the main motherboard. So what I generally tend to do is, when I've got a system up and running, is go to the fan controller. So in this particular one, we're on system fan header 3. And as you can see, I've set this to PWM and smart fan mode. Now you can set it to DC, but then the fans don't behave as they should do, and also they don't register the actual correct values. So it's definitely worth taking a look at this. Also as well, you can make changes. So currently our smart fan for system fan header 3 is currently monitoring our CPU core temperature. So as the CPU core temperature rises, obviously it will take into effect any changes we've made here. So you can, if you want to, you can change these. So if you want to lower the fans so they never go over a certain threshold, you can do that. I generally set mine so they're on full speed when the CPU gets to 70 degrees, and at around about 55, 60 degrees, thereabouts. It's kind of like about half. That for me is a nice curve, and it doesn't let the system get too noisy, but certainly when it gets things a little bit toasty, then it can ramp up a little bit. You can change this exactly how you want. Again, this is my system, but your system may be completely different. So you can, if you want to, you can change the monitoring. So you could say that you want to monitor possibly the system temperature or the chipset temperature, and then it will change the fan speeds accordingly. Also, you can monitor PCI Express 1, so basically the graphics card, and it will then ramp the fans accordingly. Generally, I tend to leave mine on CPU core. Again, entirely up to you what you do. You can do it for individual settings, so maybe system fan 1 you could set to be on the system or chipset. Again, it's pretty flexible what you can do in here. Moving on to CPU fan 1. Now in this particular system I've got a Fractal Design S360, or sorry, S36, which is a 360mm rad. So this has got a combination radiator, pump and fan combo cord, so just one plug. So this is where I control everything. Again, you can set it to auto. I find it works best with PWM enabled, and this gives me much better control. Again, similar sort of setup, so CPU at 70 degrees is full speed ahead, and that similar sort of curve that we had before. You can, if you want to, you can change it to DC voltage, and it will basically do a very, very similar thing. That gives you the voltage ratings, so at 70 degrees it will be 12 volts, 60 degrees 8 volts, 50 degrees 4 volts, and at 0 degrees 3.96 volts. Again, you can change those and configure those independently. Now that I've gone into DC mode, the fans have actually stopped spinning on the pump altogether, but I'm still getting a reading from the actual pump. The fans themselves have completely stopped. So let's put it back into PWM mode, and the fans will start back up again. So yeah, that is the fan control. There's a few things you can do in there, and also you can monitor things like your voltages whilst you're in there. So if you want to tweak this a little bit more, you can go in and change settings, etc., and see how it reflects with your CPU temperatures, your chipset temperatures, all that kind of stuff. As you can see at the moment, from my CPU core system, the MOS, the chipset, CPU socket, and PCI Express slot 1, we're currently idling in the BIOS, and all of them are roughly in the kind of low 30s, which is absolutely where I want to be. So there's no hotspots, so that means that our cooling system is working as it should do, at least whilst it's in the default kind of idle configuration. If for any reason you've got any of these which are spiking a little bit, then you can look and see what's doing, or maybe change some of your fan settings to remove those spikes. So that's pretty much it for the hardware monitor. There's not really a great deal else you can do in here. You can, if you want to, you can set all the fans full speed, or you can set all default. So if you make some changes and it's not worked out as intended, then obviously you can change settle default, and then you can set all cancel. That's pretty much it for here. Would have been nice actually to have the fan speed monitor in here, so you can do the RPM setting, but that seems, from what I can tell at the moment on this particular setup, to be actually in the main Dragon Center itself. So last up is the Board Explorer. So for those of you that are not sure what is what on the motherboard, then this is a handy little utility which shows you expanded details of what is on the board. So there is your CPU socket, and it's telling you what processor is actually on it. RAM wise, it tells you what's in there. Basically it's highlighted to see what is connected and what goes where. But if you've got this far, you probably know most of this anyway, so we'll ignore that for now. But essentially that is pretty much it. As you can see now, our boot priority has changed dramatically. So I'm only set now to boot from the built-in drive or a USB stick, so all the other ones are options or disabled. And you can't change them, and if you wanted to disable the booting from that, you can swap all these around, just drag them, drop them. If you wanted to change your boot order temporarily, you could do that. But I think that's going to be pretty much it. So we've gone through the easy mode and we've also gone through the advanced mode. Don't forget you can use certain F keys to get through various settings, like save and exit. But if you do want to save and exit, when you go back to settings, it's all in there, save and exit. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you. If it has, don't forget to give the video a like. If you've got any comments or questions, as always, put them in the comment section below. Or alternatively, you can join us in our Discord chat, or actually in the live streams on Saturdays at 9 PM UK time. So that's it. I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.